Well, hello everyone. I hope you're having a wonderful conference, and I found it so inspiring to hear from so many colleagues working in such diverse areas of our profession. And it is no underestimation to say that I've certainly learned a lot. My name's Richard. I'm a speech therapist. I work with the M&D Association and Google, working in the area of AI and voice technology. Also completing a PhD at UCL on automated speech recognition. And I am honoured. I'm honoured to be chairing this session on augmentative and alternative communication, AAC, and we have a lineup of absolutely stellar international presenters for us to learn from. Now, I would love to go through the bios, but what I really want is to hear from them. So we have Dr. Catherine Broomfield, we have Rahab Montabo, Professor Janice Murray, and Beth Molan. And we're going to have question and answers at the end, but please do put your questions in the Q&A, and I hope we can get to them all. And without further ado, please can I hand over to Dr. Catherine Broomfield.
Thank you very much, Richard. Let's just hope all the tech goes to plan. Can you see the presentation all right?
I certainly can.
Lovely. Well, thank you very much for that very generous introduction, Richard, and thank you to all the delegates who are joining me today and my colleagues who are talking about AAC. So as Richard said, my name's Catherine Broomfield. I'm a speech and language therapist, and I'm also now a clinical academic researcher. I wear multiple hats, and some of my affiliations are there on the bottom of the screen. Oh, it's going on automatically. But for now, I'm going to talk about my PhD over the next 10 minutes. So some of you may be familiar with my work because I've presented in various shapes and forms over the past few years. So today I'm going to whiz through the first half of my PhD and try and focus on some of the results. So just to give you a bit of background, I'm a clinician, and my background was working in neuro rehab initially, and then I specialised in the field of AAC, leading a local AAC service for adults in Gloucestershire. In 2016, I secured funding from the National Institute for Health Research to complete my clinical doctoral research fellowship. And the Unspoken Voices project, what I'm talking to you about today, was the research project that was part of that fellowship. The Unspoken Voices project was concerned with understanding more about the experiences of people who use AAC in order to develop the content for a patient-reported outcome measure. I'll come on to that in a minute. So the following presentation is going to tell you a little bit about my research journey and what I learned from and with people who use AAC, and how this learning informed a shift in my understanding about PROMs and about clinical practice, and perhaps how the two can work together to sort of move our practice forward. So just to start with, a patient-reported outcome measure is described as any report of the status of a patient's health condition that comes directly from the patient without interpretation of the patient's response by a clinician or anyone else. So that's the initial definition of a PROM that I was working with. And in essence, the research was sort of inspired by my clinical practice, where I felt that where I worked closely with people towards goals that were important to them, I tended to feel more satisfied, and it felt like we achieved greater outcomes. And so the project was really rooted in this concept of person-centeredness, and the idea that perhaps if we change our clinical tools from sort of initiating interactions by assessment towards maybe thinking about outcomes that are important to the people that we work with from the outset, perhaps we can achieve greater person-centeredness. And PROMs are also useful tools to evaluate person-centered services because they provide us with data from the perspective of the people using the service. So I used the US Food and Drug Administration sort of process for developing a PROM. It's a well-established process in the field. And in essence, I focused on these first three phases. So my project was concerned with establishing the need for a PROM, developing a conceptual model, and identifying the items to measure. And these arrows tell you a little bit about the process, the process of the research project, and I'll talk through those in a little bit more detail. But before I do that, I just want to mention my public involvement group, who I recruited to the project and who were really pivotal in shaping and forming the methods that I used and in really helping me to understand the data that I was collecting. And they were a critical part of my journey into becoming a clinical academic, I suppose. I've talked about the group previously in the last conference I was invited to present on with my colleague Anna Volkmer. I've written a paper, and the QR code will take you directly to all the open access papers that I've produced from my research project. So to start with, I conducted a systematic review to establish the need for a PROM for AAC. And this review identified there are currently no tools that were designed specifically as patient-reported outcome measures for AAC and were used in research studies. So this review also highlighted that out of the tools that were used, they evaluated a range of different concepts, and it wasn't clear whether those concepts were all relevant to the population of people who use AAC. But it also wasn't clear how the people were facilitated to complete those evaluation measures. So a lot of the time researchers described the PROMs they used in terms of questionnaires, but maybe failed to consistently report the nature of the sort of co-constructed communication that's commonly adopted in interactions with people who use AAC and would be essential for a lot of people who use AAC to complete a questionnaire, for example. So that sort of got me thinking a little bit. And I took that thinking into my second review, which is a narrative review, a qualitative evidence synthesis, to explore the qualitative research around the experiences of people who use AAC in order to begin to construct a conceptual framework for the PROMs. That was stage 2 of that flow chart I showed you earlier. So I learned from that review, helped me sort of to build that conceptual framework or hypothesize a conceptual framework. But I also learned that the qualitative methods used in research for people who use AAC often fell short of kind of, again, explicating the nature of that co-constructed communication. So whose voice were we actually hearing in those qualitative reports? And whose voice do we hear as clinicians and researchers in interactions with people who have communication disability? And how will the nature of that voice influence the sort of patient-reported outcomes that we can gather? So as I started to move through my research project, as often happens, I was generating a lot more questions than perhaps there was answers. I conducted 2 phases of qualitative research. The first was a longitudinal qualitative study. This is in the process of being published at the moment. It's been accepted by the International Journal for Language and Communication Disabilities, and again will be published open access imminently. So watch this space, and I'll tweet about it once that paper's out. So I followed 7 people, 5 people, completed the longitudinal study through their journey, through their AAC journey with a regional specialised assessment service. I met them before their assessment, after they'd received AAC devices, and then at 6 and 12 months follow-up. So this data was really critical in helping me to see the broader landscape in which people experience speech and language therapy and AAC interventions, and to recognise the impact of time on the experience and on expectations of outcomes from AAC. And that was a really important learning point for me as a researcher and reflecting back on my clinical practice. During the second qualitative study, which I've called a cross-section qualitative research study, I interviewed 7 people who had experience of using AAC. And the aim of this study was to really expand and extend the hypothesized conceptual framework for the PROM, and also to start developing items that could potentially create the content for a PROM. So with help from my public involvement group and the supervisory team, we were able to enhance those initial concepts through developing domains, or the constructs that create the concepts, which you can see in blue on the slide, and then generated a set of 33 items. And if you'd like those items specifically, I can share those with you. Please do email me, but I've sort of kept it quite simple for the purpose of this presentation. We also began to recognise some of the interconnections between domains. So that is like how changes perhaps targeted in one area may well affect the perceived improvements in another. And those sorts of things often fall outside of our control in clinical practice, but may be really important to recognise in terms of how we measure what outcomes are important to people. This study also provided data to support the development of what I've called a kind of theory about AAC mediated interaction. And it goes back to some of these questions I had about voice and how voice emerges between a range of different communication signals used by people who have communication disability and the people that they're involved with, the people involved in their interactions within a context. So it really, this sort of, the data that sort of helped me develop this theory enabled me to consider in greater depth what a patient-reported outcome measure would need to look like in order to reflect the multimodal and co-constructed nature of voice in interactions with people who have communication disability. And this idea of sort of polyphony, or this multiple voices which interact in order to create the meaning and the expression for people who use AAC. So perhaps rather than patient-reported outcome measures, what about person-centered outcome measures? A slightly different concept, but perhaps shifts us from that idea of patient to person and from that idea of being reported to being centered around a person. Numbers aren't necessarily enough if tools are really going to shift our practice towards more person-centeredness. We need tools that perhaps shape dialogue rather than direct us towards specific endpoints or goals. We need measures that capture qualitative as well as quantitative outcomes, and also are kind of able to be co-designed so that they're truly accessible by the people that we're interacting with, but also that are dynamic and recognise the importance of outcomes that change over time, and how that's something we need to capture in terms of how we practice alongside people. And this notion of person-centred care and services perhaps requires more than just clinical tools. This is maybe one of my key learning points from my PhD, but perhaps also a more person-centred perspective on how we practice as clinicians. So recognising that a person is more than just an individual, but someone who is part of a wider social dynamic and whose family, carers and circumstances all influence the nature of the voice that's created through our interactions. As clinicians, we also meet people on a journey, and we need to be agile and respectful of how we move in and out of people's lives, helping people to navigate their own path, perhaps, rather than imposing our own maps or compasses. And this really requires a bit of a shift in our clinical perspective, from experts to people with a complementary set of expertise that can complement rather than compensate for knowledge of the people that we work with. So really valuing elements of their landscape and their lived experience, the skills they already bring to their interactions, so that we can work sort of in synergy with them rather than maybe experts who provide advice and opinion. So with this, we perhaps need to think about how we talk about the social model of disability, but how do we use our tools and our clinical perspectives to really engage more meaningfully with what that means to people, and perhaps consider notions of quality of life over participation and activity, which may help expand our professional vision. So that's the end of the main part of my presentation. So I just want to say thank you, and these are my contact details, and I want to acknowledge the contribution of my PhD supervisory team on the screen there. I recognise that I've mentioned quite a few sort of different notions and concepts and theories within the presentation, and my main aim, I suppose, was to provoke you to sort of think about how you can engage with some of those concepts and theories within your own practice. I have got a bit of a reading list which I put together. So again, if anything resonated with you, or you want to find out more about any of the things I've talked about, please do contact me by email. I'll look forward to having more dialogue with you there, and hopefully questions at the end.
Thank you so much, Catherine. That was so interesting. And we're going to move straight through. We're going to move on. We've got so many interesting voices to hear. To Rahab Motabo, thank you so much for joining us. I'm going to hand straight over to you. Ooh, I think you're on mute. I think you're on mute, my friend. Oh, I think you're still on mute. I'm really sorry. No worries, no problem. Don't you worry.
Am I okay now?
I can hear you now.
Fantastic. Okay, fantastic.
And you just need to share your slides. That's all.
Oh yes. I am so sorry.
No
okay,
problem.
I'm gonna do that right now. Okay, there we go. Thank you. Can you confirm that you can see that, Richard?
I certainly can. Yeah.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. Thank you so much for the very, very warm welcome, Richard. And thank you very much. I am very happy to be speaking among such great people who work in AAC. So as said already, my name is Rahab Mutapo, and I am a student at the University of Pretoria in South Africa. And my study is basically on the development of a Sepedi non-electronic AAC system for use with pre-literate children. And I'm under the excellent leadership of Professor Chun Singh, who's at the University of Pretoria, as well as Prof. Gloria Soto in the United States. So that is my biography. Bottom line is just that I am a student at the University of Pretoria in South Africa, but I actually work at Sefako Makgatho Health Sciences University, which is a medical university in South Africa, and I practice as a speech language pathologist and audiologist. And yeah, I'm just basically trying to complete my PhD. So that is my acknowledgement. I'm not going to get too much into it. I just want to acknowledge one of my funders, the NGAP, as well as the Saudi Law, which are both part of the government support for researchers. Right, so I'm not going to dwell too much on this slide as well. As we all know, AAC is just basically any attempt to compensate for any communication impairment, activity limitations, as well as participation restrictions of persons with severe disorders or communication. So I'm very glad that I'm speaking among speech therapists, so I don't have to explain extra on that. So I want to touch a little bit on the fact that literature in the recent years especially suggests that there is a global urgent need for design of AAC systems that are linguistically and culturally appropriate. I attended the multilingualism section of the program yesterday, and it was very enlightening, and this was really part of what they presented. So such systems really lead to better social integration as well as a sense of identity. So they are more likely to be used and experienced as helpful. So I think a lot of authors have written a lot about abandonment and what they think some of the factors that contribute to that are. So the benefit for pre-literate children from graphic symbol-based systems is really just that before they are literate, these systems will enable them then to communicate. All right, then I'm just going to speak a little bit around the design of AAC systems in South Africa. So in South Africa, we have 11 official South African languages, but actually only less than 10 people are actually English home language speakers. One of my colleagues who presented yesterday, Casey, and I believe she's here in the audience, is one of those who are only English speaking. But the rest of us really, we are bilingual. I mean, I speak 5 South African languages. So that basically speaks to how diverse we are in terms of language. So currently there is no graphic symbol-based AAC system with large pre-stored vocabulary that is available in any other language other than English and Afrikaans. But I mean, if you know the history of South Africa, you do know that we were previously, I want to use the word colonized, but also we are from a very debatable history in terms of inequalities and all of that. So English and Afrikaans will obviously have a little bit more benefit because those were the populations that were prioritized back then instead of us, Black South Africans particularly. So it is for that reason that we are still quite behind in terms of the rest of all our languages. All right, so I'm going to speak on the Sepedi language. So Sepedi is basically one language in all the native South African languages. So it is spoken by about 4.6 million people in South Africa, and that is an estimated 20,000 children who probably speak this language and may need to benefit from AAC. So obviously, if there is no such a system, it means those children are then disadvantaged because they are not given an ability to communicate. Right. So I had to obviously, as part of my PhD project, read up around the design of assistive technology. So really, I can confirm that it has proven to be a very complex task, to try and figure out what the design of assistive technology is all about. So amongst many tensions that I could read up about, there is particularly one that exists between the designer as well as between designing for all as well as designing for one. So you ask yourself, if you're designing a system, do I keep a broader population in mind, or do I just keep a specific population in mind? That is really a cause of tension. So a review done by my supervisor, Professor Chun Singh, in 2022 showed that there are design processes for graphic symbol-based AAC systems where they are not always reported in detail in the published literature. So basically, just from that, we then came to the conclusion that when you are trying to basically derive a graphic symbol-based AAC system, you would need to make decisions within the 4 main groups of characteristics of what a system really needs to encompass. So amongst the 4 characteristics, the first one is the vocabulary that needs to be included. The second one is the graphic symbols that need to represent the vocabulary, as well as the vocabulary organization, which is the layout, and lastly, the physical characteristics. So we also then delved into the research, and what literature then showed is that right now people are prioritizing, or authors and academics are prioritizing what we call the human-centered design, the HCD. So it is where designers learn from and cooperate with stakeholders in the design process. So we've moved from you as a designer just deciding, making all the decisions in terms of what you think an AEC system should be all about. But now instead, we are looking at the involvement of stakeholders in the development process, which we really think is essential in terms of meeting the gap between the users' needs as well as what you think as a developer. So then the dilemma becomes to strike a balance between the researcher's voice as well as the user's voice. So an example of this is the participatory design of low-tech systems as done by Amory in 2022. Right, so then I'm going to speak about my PhD project. So the main aim of this project was really to design a non-electronic Sepedi graphic symbol-based AEC system for pre-literate children using an HCD process, and to preliminary evaluate the system. So that is really the main aim of the project. And I get questions around why did I choose specifically a low-tech system? And I'm going to make it very practical and say it was really based on the usefulness of what I think it would be in a country like ours, where we really have a lot of socioeconomic constraints. So I really thought that I should take that in mind. It's very lovely to have all these high-tech systems, and I think they're quite useful, but I do think that as well there is a gap for low-tech systems. So my project is basically derived in terms of 3 phases, and I'm only going to be speaking on the 2 phases for today. So the first phase is basically where I looked at the needs analysis as well as to gather information on the design requirements. Then the second phase is basically where I do the experience prototyping as well as the stakeholder evaluation and feedback. And right now, as I speak to you, I'm currently trying to complete my phase 3, which is the product evaluation. Right. So in terms of phase 1 is where I said I looked at the needs analysis as well as gathering of design requirements. So for this phase particularly, my aim was really to obtain initial input from stakeholders on the need for this type of a system, its design requirements, as well as where they think it could be applied. So the method I used here was the qualitative community engaged approach, where I followed techniques such as focus groups, individual interviews, focus group interviews, as well as individual interviews, and paired depth interviews, which is how I conducted this first phase. So this is just a sample of what my participants or the different stakeholders looked like. So I had speech therapists, I had parents of children with complex communication needs, I had teachers from special schools, which is your special education for these children, as well as 2 adults who basically use AEC systems and are from obviously a Sepedi speaking background, as well as I thought it would be very important to involve 2 Sepedi speaking linguists as part of the stakeholder group. Right. So how I did my analysis was that I followed the qualitative content analysis to analyze all my data. This is basically where I looked at both the inductive and the deductive processes, and I basically used the Atlas TI software. All right. So these are basically some of my findings. So with regard to the purpose of the system, some of the participants highlighted that they think it would really provide access to communication, and that is 14 participants out of my 21, as well as it would really give a chance for social inclusion. In terms of the vocabulary, they felt that the vocabulary that is chosen for the system should be very specific to the environment, and really it should follow a core fringe approach. In terms of the graphic symbols that we should choose, they really felt that they should represent the culture and the language that Sepedi speaking children use. Right, so those are some of the codes. I really don't want to get into that. This presentation will be available after this. I'm just trying to regulate and to preserve time. All right, then also we looked at the organization. So we asked them questions as well around the organization, and the participants really felt that it should encourage, the system should encourage the left to right sentence formation. So the words should be grouped according to how a normal Sepedi sentence is formulated. And then, yeah, I think with graphic symbols, I have already spoken about how they should really embrace culture and language. Then with regard to the physical characteristic, which is the last part of the groupings, they felt that it should be a single page type of format, and that it should have a slot for those changeable overlays in terms of the fringe vocabulary, so that one can put in the specific vocabulary for that aspect. So they also pointed out that the system should really embrace the use of color, because it's a system that is made for children. It should also be cost effective, and this is exactly what I spoke about. It should embrace the context that we live in South South Africa, and it's always about cost and money and economics, as well as it should be durable, because they felt that it should be a system that they can use long over time. Right, then I'm just going to run you through the phase 2, which is the experience prototyping and the stakeholder evaluation feedback. So for this stage, the main aim was really to design and refine the system by engaging in cycles of prototyping as well as stakeholder feedback. So I really tried to keep the same stakeholder feedback group. So I tried to get participants from the different stakeholder groups, all right? So the study method that I used was the multi-method. Yeah, basically that is what I used. The researcher then engaged in experience prototyping. So that is basically where I developed the first prototype, and I gave them a chance to try it out, to share the experience of how it felt like to use it, as well as to provide me with the suggested changes. So like I said, I used the same participants across all my phases, because I felt it's very continuous and it provides that iterative cycle part of it. So for the results as well, I can definitely say that during the iterative phases, our stakeholders got to experience what really it means to be an AAC user, and the experience of this was quite informative. Some of them said that it is impressive, they felt that they are happy, it looked very beautiful and very attractive. If you remember what my cover slide looked like, that is really what my prototype looks like. Right. So some of the suggested changes that I wanted to run you through were with regard to, once again, the 4 different aspects. So for vocabulary, they gave me different suggestions of what I could change. So for example, verbs, they felt that for Insipedi there is ba, which means to be. They felt that it also existed in what a specific grammatical group we call concords, which doesn't exist in the English language. So they felt that should be removed for verbs. They felt that we should add some verbs like hlapa, which means to bath, and they really felt that alphabets, individual phonemes should also be on the board, because then it can encourage literacy as well. Right. Some of the graphic symbol suggestions that they had were quite interesting. They felt that the structure that I'd chosen for church, which means gereke, which is point number 2 over there, they felt that it was not really symbolic of the specific culture that we exist in, which was quite interesting, because I thought I'm speaking myself and I should have understanding of this, but they really didn't agree. And this just shows the importance of involving different stakeholders. Right. And when it comes to organization of the layout, they really felt that, they wanted some items on the board to be moved around. They felt that some groupings should also be done. And this was quite informative, because this was not what I had in mind. Physical characteristics, they also had a lot to say here, but I just chose a few here. So one of them being that they suggested that we increase the word font size, because they felt some of our children really have visual impediments as well. And they felt that I could improve the consistency of the casing of some of the words. So this just shows you that my different stakeholders were very cognizant of what we're trying to do, and they were very, very intentional about giving me their feedback. So in conclusion, the data highlights that the stakeholders' needs and design, the study basically highlights the stakeholders' needs and the design requirements. As you can see, they gave me very important feedback. So my findings were really quite unique, and they had different focus low-keys. And this, for me as a co-designer, was quite informative, because I realized that really it's not a one-man show, and their input is quite important. If I'm going to say I'm co-designing with them, I need to allow them the voice to give different opinions on what they think, and also just to amplify what they think. All right. So to an extent, the usefulness and acceptance of a system really relies on what the stakeholders' feedback is, and as well as how you nurture what they say. So this way, you would realize that they understand the context, and they will have a different view in terms of the use of the system as well, because they were part of it and they gave their input instead of just creating a system and giving it to them. So with that said, I just want to say that these are my references, and in Sepedi we say ki a leboga, which means thank you very much. I'm very honored. Thank you so much, Richard. I hope I didn't go over time. Thanks.
You did an excellent job. Oh my goodness, you shared so much in such a quick time. Well done, you all. And with that, thank you, Rahab. That was fabulous. And now I'll hand over to Professor Janice Murray, and with Beth, with Beth Modem.
Thank you, Richard, for that. Can I just ask you to confirm you can see my slide?
Yes, I can.
Thank you. Thank you, and thank you to the Royal College of Speech and Language Therapists for giving us this opportunity to provide you with an update on where we're at with the AAC clinical guidance. So although I'm presenting the slides here today, I'm accompanied by my colleague, Beth Molam, and who will join us in the Q&A session at the end of this. As you can see, this is a huge team effort. The guidance has been fully co-produced. We have had around our author table AAC users, family members and partners, and we have the 4 countries of the UK represented within this group. More thanks to the Royal College team who've really been supporting us along the way. Particularly, I want to shout out to Stephanie Holderness and Lorna Baxter. And finally, a thanks that I will keep returning to as I go through the slides to the RCSLT members and other interested parties who have provided us with hugely invaluable feedback, very positive and constructive feedback in terms of the consultation process. So what I intend to do over the next few minutes is give you an overview of where we're up to with the guidelines and the process that we have gone through. So, some sound bites about where we started, what we had to consider before we started conceptualizing the aspects of content that we might include. And I guess I want to say that our opening premise was that the evidence base that we draw upon would include appreciating the lived experience of the AAC users, their families and support networks, and how these influences would impact on intervention decisions. That also led us to really having a debate as an author team around appreciating how user identity may change across contexts, across different forms of AAC, across time. And the third element that I want to share today that we spent quite a lot of time considering was the very wide scope of AAC practice in terms of actually it dips into many clinical areas that a speech and language therapist may be involved in. We could be considering a 3-year-old who as yet has some undiagnosed needs, all the way through to perhaps considering someone much older who has a presentation of one or other of the dementias. So we had lots of discussion about what was in scope for these guidelines and what might not be in scope for these guidelines, and that set the scene for the kind of literature searching and the literature reviewing that we did. One quick thing I will say here, we had a discussion about where do we include AI and where do we include assistive technology, and we concluded we would mention it, but actually that would be out of scope in terms of doing it justice within the AAC guidelines. And the last thing to mention here before moving on is the terminology challenges, the ever-changing terminology specifically related to AAC, not just because of technology change, but because of changes in theoretical and lived experience perspectives and how we might describe ourselves and others and what we might be doing. So we had to navigate that in terms of where we felt we were at and where we might be wanting to present in terms of moving forward as a guideline tool. So prior to the consultation process, I guess we had a sense of what documents we might be trying to develop that would then eventually appear in web page formats. And I guess there were 3 key elements to that. One was what became a very extensive member clinical guidance document where the detailed content was housed. But alongside that, there were other elements that were really important to include, and that included a 1-page guideline statement summary, key references that were based on our initial literature review process, key resources and links to video examples, and I'll come back to some of those elements later on. And also, a glossary was going to be really important in terms of this sense of so many synonyms in relation to how we might describe aspects of AAC. The second element that we were going to be producing was a public document. And at this point in the process, before consultation, the author group felt quite strongly that the public documentation should look very similar to the main clinical member documentation. And again, I'll come back to that. And the third document that we had a choice as to whether we would include or not was the position statement intended for a particular audience. And I'm going to come to that in the last slide. So that was where we were at the point that we went out to member consultation and wider consultation. Rather unusually, we did member and public consultation at one and the same time. And that was actually very helpful to us as an author group. That resulted in some decisions that we have made. I should tell you that we are now in the editing phase. We are working on edits as I speak to you. What we have had the agreement of RCSLT is that the member page, the clinical guidance documentation, that more extensive documentation with all the links and resources will be available publicly. The fact that we had produced a very similar looking public document, we'd received really helpful feedback that actually maybe what we had without realising it was a very expert group of AAC users and family members who were very keen to have access to very similar information. But actually we needed to maybe stop and think about people coming to AAC new, and that more extensive document was going to be a little bit over-facing and over-much. So we're now currently working on an accessible summary, and that will include video recording of key content. And that would obviously be, excuse me, available to anyone, not just potential family members and AAC users. But in the main document, the clinical guidance document, we've got several sections. So we've got contextualization sections that I've listed here. So the AAC context, related terminology, discussions around and definitions around need, medical diagnoses, and how that might relate to speech and language diagnoses. And again, there was a sort of wide spread in terms of how people might describe AAC tools and resources depending on the type of speech and language diagnosis they were considering. We've also going to have an element around collaboration and co-production, and then a more extensive section on what actually might be the role of the speech and language therapist in AAC service delivery. And that then leads on to a set of 16 guideline statements that are summarised under these particular headings. And I just want to draw your attention to two in particular, one being conversation partner training and support, and the other being managing transitions. We had very, very positive feedback about the inclusion of those sections, and I'm just going to say that I'm going to read out one of the guidelines as it stands at the minute, but we are in edit mode still, and I want you to see if you can spot the subtle change here. So there are a variety of evidence-based communication partner training programs and strategies that have been developed to support communication between AAC users, families, supporters and professionals. And it's important for SLTs to understand what's available to support the AAC users and their communication partners. I'm just going to leave you there with that communication conversation, because I think we had a very interesting debate about what's the difference and is there a difference. And then managing transitions has always been something that has proved to be very challenging for many AAC users and their family members. And so we've spent quite an extensive amount of time working on how we might think about that and describe that. So those are just a couple of sound bites around the guideline statements, and there's more detailed content and advice around each of those statements. So if you recall, I mentioned that the other document that we had agreed we would develop was a position statement. This is a very short punchy document, because the target audiences here are dropping in to look for particular things that might guide them in terms of how to think about policy, commissioning of services, how to then develop that service as you move along. So what this offers is key statements in relation to reference detail about how the speech and language therapist may support the AAC users. We've provided an accessible summary of what AAC might be, and actually we're in the process of changing that quite dramatically based on feedback that we've received from you and the collective. A little on incidence and prevalence. That's actually quite challenging for us because some of our stats at the moment are getting a little bit elderly. So we are kind of reviewing that to see if we can update that a little bit more. And then again, being mindful of, we're trying to give an across UK perspective, we've included elements around what you might expect to experience depending on where you're positioned across the UK in terms of a local referral pathway. And then a couple of key references to just have people considering how to take AAC forward. So thank you again for that feedback. It has been very helpful. So as I round up, and hopefully I'm doing okay for time, we're basically, as I've said, currently editing the main document. We're going through an evaluation of all potential resources on offer and some suggested during the consultation process. We're cross-checking terminology and other references in relation to existing RCSLT guidelines in other areas and also NICE guidelines. And we're developing this accessible summary, which will definitely have podcast elements to it. The timeline is that we will be handing the document over to college to then go through their proofing editorial process, and our aim is to have it out with you sometime in January. So that's me. Thank you very much for listening, and hopefully I have.
You've done great.
Stopped time. Sorry about that.
No. Because of the session, it kind of went a little later anyway. But thank you, Janice. That was fabulous, and thank you to all the presenters. Super interesting. I've got a few questions, but I can see there are some questions in the Q&A. And what I'm going to do is actually I'm going to unmute everyone. So if you want to raise your hand, then we can have a chat as well. We have some time until 10 past. But the first question that came through was from Emily, and everyone's welcome to take a shot at this. And how did you collect the views and who from on creating the system? So I'm going to, and Emily, please jump in if there's anything extra to add there. Otherwise, anyone can just take that. I think you're on mute, Janice, if you were talking there. See if I can unmute you. No, I can't seem to unmute you. I'm really sorry. Is there anyone else? Yeah, let's just see if we can anybody talk apart from me? Well, that's not great, is it? Let me see if I can look in the guide. It's only 300 pages. I'll have a quick nose.
I appear to have managed to unmute myself.
I think we're unmuted.
We are saved.
There we go.
So please jump in, anyone. on that one.
I was actually just going to ask for clarification in reference to the system. Was that directed at Rahab's research or at Catherine?
Yes. I think I'm also curious, but while I'm on the platform, I can maybe just speak up on it, particularly for my project. But if they're asking how we gathered the data, like I said, for the first phase, so basically, I'm so sorry I had to run through my presentation, so I think I have a bit of time now just to explain a few things. But what I actually want to say is that first things first, like I said, it's not very well documented in terms of how systems are designed in the first place. So what we had to do was just to read up on that and try see what different authors have done. So in the first phase was just basically to do the needs analysis as well as to find out what the design requirements are for the system. So how I did that was that I ran focus groups, I did individual interviews as well as paired interviews, paired in-depth interviews with the linguists, individual interviews with the AAC users, because obviously it made sense. I can't put them in a group setting, it was practical reasons. But with the focus groups, I then did with the teachers first, and they had their own sessions. Then I did with the parents, and then I also did with the SLTs. That's how I did the first phase. Then when it came to the second phase, which was basically more the experience prototyping, as well as gathering feedback of what the stakeholders think about the first prototype, I did that through experience prototyping sessions. So what I did was that I presented to them what they gave me in phase one, and I showed them how I implemented what they suggested onto the system. Then from there, I gave them different activities for them to trial out the system. So for example, how would you greet someone using the system? So I gave them a trial run of how an AAC user would basically use the system. And then from that, I asked them to give me the experiences in terms of what they felt, what they lacked. I mean, you would find limitations such as it's basically a communication board. Obviously, it wouldn't have all the vocabulary. So those are some of the things I was hoping that they would see and they would be honest about. Then from there, they would give me suggestions in terms of the different design requirements, such as vocabulary, such as the graphic symbols, such as the physical properties, as well as the organization. So I would open the question up to say, what do you think about the vocabulary that I've chosen here? Do you think some words should be there? Do you think some words are not necessary? Do you think they're the right dialect? I mean, language is a very complicated thing, So I would give them chances to do that, and they would give me feedback. So that is basically how I did the two phases of my project. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Wow, that was great. Now there was a question from Marisa, who said, I'd be interested in any advice for creating low-tech AAC systems for people with aphasia. Often I find this client group can be resistant to using picture symbols, which can be perceived as childish. Actually, I completely relate to this question. I have sometimes created bespoke materials using photographs instead. Any thoughts, advice, collaboration? Welcome. So who would like to take that one? Everyone's being so polite. Hey, Janice is going to take that one.
I'll start, shall I? And then others can join in. I think it's a hugely challenging thing. And I guess where I've always started is to see if there is any residual literacy recognition, and maybe tag that initially, not necessarily with symbols, because I do think there are challenges with introducing picture symbols, but potentially very bespoke line drawings created with the individual, or I have used in the past often photographs, and it's much easier to collect photographs now in a way that maybe then gives you opportunity for topic discussion rather than perhaps something that may be potentially less useful in terms of just coming up with vocabulary items. And although this has been primarily developed with younger people in mind and is technological, I think having pictures that have multiple reference points within them that then potentially allow you, so composite style pictures that then allow you to perhaps explore what the conversational topic might be around. That would be where I would start. And they might not be traditionally things that you might describe as AAC tools, but that certainly is where I would go. But I'm not saying that that is the only and the best answer.
Thank you. Anyone else like to add to this one?
Yeah, I think maybe just building on what Janice was saying about that, the visual scenes that you can point to sort of different hotspots on. I think people who have aphasia, I used to work with them in clinical practice. My background is with adults, and they, it is very difficult to get them engaged with using AAC by and large. They are quite hard. So we probably maybe need to think about AAC a bit differently for them. And again, working alongside them to create a tool which is much more bespoke as opposed to maybe some of the picture books we're used to working with, and we're building AAC competence with children and young people. So perhaps, working a lot and just sort of spending a bit of time with them, seeing what strategies and tools they're already using, and perhaps expanding and developing on that. So if they're already using their phone quite a lot, for example, can we do any screen captures that you're picking up on particular websites they like to go to regularly? Or perhaps if they like to carry around an iPad with them. Sometimes people just like it there for comfort, actually, and having a tool to give them confidence to go out and use some of their other, sort of no tech AAC strategies, like gestures, like keywords, maybe sort of facial expressions, things like that. And sometimes it's just building on residual competence and residual habit and residual behaviours can actually be sort of provide a greater foundation for adding additional AAC tools and strategies.
I love those. I love all the answers because it's client-centered and it's functional. And certainly within my work, when I used to work on a stroke ward, this is very sudden. The change is sudden. And then to ask people to communicate in different ways, there's a lot to talk about here. There's a lot to consider, and also, I kind of love all these different approaches. With your permission, we have more questions, so we'll just keep moving. Any thoughts around AAC assessment processes and any top tips on what you would or wouldn't use? The only thing I think is 100% needed every time is use a voice in whichever shape or form you do this. But what else would you say is essential? Any other top tips appreciated? This is from anonymous. So yeah. So
could I maybe ask Beth if you want to start constructing something, and whilst you're doing that, then I'm happy to consider. I think the first thing that I would be considering is the context for that individual and the contexts in which they may want to be using AAC. And when I say AAC, aided AAC, rather than, as Catherine's already described, using whole body communication that we all use. And that for me would be a fact-finding mission. What contexts of communication are there likely to be? And are there things that will be more suitable in those contexts than others? So it's not always easy to be listing a range of AAC materials and AAC methods, but actually the majority of AAC users that I know do not just use one AAC system. So I would be unpicking that, I think, as a critical element before I started thinking about what the AAC system might look like for that person.
So just building on that, Janice, when you think about the model that I proposed from the outcomes point of view, think about what people want to achieve, actually considering those three areas in terms of what their existing communication skills and strategies are. So what are you building upon, as well as what is it that they want to express explicitly, and then thinking about the context, including the other people in their environment where they perhaps are on an AAC journey or on a condition trajectory as well, might be important. And then thinking about those maybe longer term impacts. How will AAC, or how will an additional AAC system enable them to enhance their quality of life, or their set of experiences, or their kind of sense of identity and future self? So I think those, I'm sort of obviously self-serving, but I think those three areas provide quite useful places in which to situate your assessment sort of focuses.
I think if I can also jump in there, Richard, if you allow me. I really agree with the last two speakers, Yanis and Kathy. I really agree with both of them. I think, and I'm speaking a little bit out of depth because I'm more a pediatric speech therapist, but I think two most important things that I would really consider would be really to involve, particularly with adults, to involve the individual as well. You know, I think we sometimes get lost in the mix of thinking we are the speech therapists, and therefore, we are, more understanding of this process, and maybe we may think that we may be able to suggest what they should be using. But I think it's very important, particularly for adults and really more older clients or participants or patients or whoever, to involve them as well in the process, And then another very important aspect that they've just highlighted now is just the multimodal aspect of it. I really, really, really agree with that, because it's not so much about just picking one specific AAC system and hoping that they'll rely on that only, but it's also really incorporating all the others as well, because in any case, that's how we all communicate. That is the reality of it. But more than anything, I also thought about the idea of dynamic assessments as well, assessing in multiple forms and as well as with multiple systems to see what most likely may work with that specific client. So those are just the pointers that I can think of as we're having this discussion. But yeah, thank you very much for that, for those two comments at the beginning. Thanks.
Great. And if Beth,
I wonder if we might just give Beth another moment or two, because I can see she's busy.
Yeah, working hard. No problem.
There's a really quick one here in the chat from Jennifer Benson, just asking if there's a document for collection of outcome measures to use in clinical practice. And the quick answer to that is not yet, but I've secured some additional funding to try to pull a tool of some sort together within the next sort of 12 to 18 months and start to try to test and evaluate that with clinicians and service users. So watch this space. Beth, you look like you're ready.
From my perspective, it is definitely about asking the individual what they want. I am a creative communicator, and I don't use just one method, and I would need people to understand that. My own experience was a long time ago when I first got AAC, but at every time since I've been fully involved in the process.
That's awesome. Thank you. That's really fabulous. Yeah, exactly. Involved. Let's involve everyone, even the people that use it. That would actually be nice, wouldn't it?
Definitely.
So for a question from Jessica, any advice on supporting a young person who would benefit from AAC due to significantly unclear speech, but he's quite self-conscious about using it? We tried different options, low tech, high tech, and to me, he will say it's helpful, but then never uses it in class. What do you think?
So a lot of the young people I spoke to during my research project really liked having peer supporters and mentors. I don't know if you want to add to that, Beth, but that came up quite strongly as how people were inspired to start using their AAC devices when they saw other people who were further along their journey. And a few different people mentioned that. So perhaps doing some buddying, or maybe finding a sort of slightly more mature AAC user who could support that individual in school even might be a nice place to start. That's just from some of the experiences of people that I've spoken to, rather than, from my own clinical experience.
Yeah, I think it's really hard if that person is the only person perhaps in their classroom using that particular type of system. So they have no role model of how they are, how they might come across. I'm just filling time for Beth here. And I think inviting people in, if you don't have, there are a lot of role models around through the organisation called One Voice, where I'm quite sure, and they're regionally located, so there potentially is someone who could come in and inspire the school, the class, by doing some kind of presentation or talk.
Yeah. I fully agree with you, Janice. And what I actually also want to say is I can't help but think of one concept, aided language stimulation, you know? I think you're absolutely right. I mean, it's a bit odd if you're the only person that's using that language or that system in your environment. Of course, you're going to feel like you're a little bit, you know, out, and it's just you who's using that system. So I think it's also quite important that, you know, in our parent trainings, in our caregiver trainings, we really try and model that, and, you know, encourage our caregivers and adults and older people who are communicating with this AAC user to really model it as well, to also use that system, you know. I always think of it like a language, you know. I can't imagine now I'm the only one speaking Sepedi and everybody else is speaking English. You know, obviously to some point I would want to leave my language and use English as well. So I would think it's almost similar with an AAC user. And yeah, but I really agree with that idea of having like a support group or like an older AAC user who can be like an inspiration to that younger AAC user. I absolutely agree with that. So yeah, thanks.
Thank you. And yes, now I have a request. We are over time, but I want to wait for Beth, if that's okay. So
Yes.
I want to hear what Beth says. So I'm going to wrap up just to, you know, kind of, because I can now, but we're going to wait for Beth. Just to say thank you so much to Dr. Catherine Brumfield, Rahab Motabo, Professor Janice Murray, and Beth Molem for what I think has been an absolutely inspiring session, and, you know, something that I think that I'll be reflecting on. I think AAC is changing. There's lots of things about AAC, but actually in some other ways it's exactly the same as it's always been. It's about the people themselves. That's how it feels to me. And, you know, kind of co-design, co-development, understanding what people actually want to do seems to be a theme that is one of the themes that has run through these sets of presentations. So it has been a joy. It's been a joy to hear this, and it feels like this conversation is just starting, and certainly with Janice's publications coming up, and Catherine's work and Ray's work. I am going to hand over to Beth.
I think it is about getting in the right crowd. For example, my role models have been from One Voice and Isaac. Before I met other people who used AAC like me, if I didn't know adults used AAC. So I definitely recommend get out there and find your crowd.
Yeah. Agree.
Well said, and what a great way to finish. So let's all go out and find our crowd. Let's do that, and thank you again, and wishing you a great rest of conference. So bye bye.
Thanks so much, Richard.